I met Thomas at a campus bonfire when we were both 22. And honestly, I was drawn to how different he was from the other guys I'd dated. While everyone else was being loud and trying to impress people, he was sitting on a log just watching the flames, completely content to be still. When I plopped down next to him and started chatting, he actually listened instead of just waiting for his turn to talk. He was this steady, reliable type what my friends would probably call boring. But I found it kind of refreshing after years of dating guys who were all drama and no substance. You're not much of a party person, are you? I asked him that first night, and he just smiled and said he preferred smaller groups. There was something about his calmness that made me feel settled, which was weird because I'd always been the spontaneous one, the one who made last-minute plans and dragged people on adventures. But Thomas had this way of making me feel like maybe I didn't always have to be on, like maybe it was okay to just exist without constantly entertaining everyone around me. We started dating, and those 4 years were honestly pretty rocky. I'd get frustrated with how he planned everything 3 days in advance, how he needed his little routines and schedules, how he'd write things down in this notebook like our relationship was some kind of project he was managing. Sometimes I suggest we just drive somewhere random for the weekend, and he'd get this slightly panicked look and start asking about hotel reservations and whether we'd check the weather. It drove me absolutely crazy. But then he'd do something sweet like remember that I mentioned liking a specific type of flower, and he'd show up with a bouquet just because it was Tuesday. The thing about Thomas was that he was always trying to make me happy, even when I was being completely unreasonable. If I complained that we never did anything exciting, he'd plan some elaborate surprise. If I said I felt like he wasn't paying enough attention to me, he'd clear his entire schedule for the weekend. Looking back, I probably should have appreciated how hard he was trying. But at the time, it just felt like he was checking boxes instead of actually understanding what I needed. When we got married, everything changed for the better. Those first 2 years were honestly beautiful, like the kind of marriage that made other people jealous. Thomas had this way of making me feel completely secure and loved. And for once in my life, I wasn't constantly looking for the next thing to make me happy, because I already was happy. He'd wake up early to make me coffee before work. He'd listen to me complain about my job at the therapy center without trying to fix everything. And he'd hold me at night like I was the most precious thing in the world. I remember thinking that maybe I'd been wrong about needing constant excitement, that maybe this quiet, steady love was actually what I'd been looking for all along. Then we lost the first baby at 12 weeks, and something shifted between us. Thomas tried to be supportive, but he got all weird and careful around me. Like I might break if he said the wrong thing. I needed him to be normal, to treat me like I was still the same person. But instead, he started tiptoeing around me and speaking in this gentle voice that made me want to scream. When we lost the second baby, 18 months later, I felt like something inside me just shut down completely. Here I was, supposed to be helping other people's kids as a therapist, and I couldn't even keep my own babies alive. Thomas kept suggesting we go to counseling together, kept trying to plan these romantic dates to cheer me up. But honestly, I just felt numb to everything. The worst part was how patient he was being, how understanding, because it made me feel even more broken that I couldn't appreciate what a good husband I had. I started feeling like maybe I didn't deserve him, or maybe he didn't really understand what I was going through, or maybe we just weren't as compatible as I'd thought. When my girlfriends invited me to Vegas for a long weekend, Thomas practically pushed me out the door, saying I needed some fun and girl time. The first night we were there, we ended up at this hotel bar, and there was this bartender named Preston who kept making me laugh. He was everything Thomas wasn't spontaneous, a little reckless, the kind of guy who'd quit his job and move to Nevada just because he felt like it. When my friends went up to their rooms, I stayed at the bar talking to Preston, and when he got off work, he asked if I wanted to keep the conversation going in his room. I knew I shouldn't, but I also felt like I'd been dead inside for months, and here was someone who was making me feel alive again. It wasn't about not loving Thomas, it was about remembering what it felt like to be desired by someone who didn't know about all my failures and losses. Preston didn't know I was broken. To him, I was just this interesting woman who was funny and attractive, not someone's wife who couldn't do the one thing wives were supposed to do. It was just one night, and I figured what Thomas didn't know couldn't hurt him. When I got home, he was so happy to see me, asking about the trip and telling me how much he'd missed me. And I felt terrible, but also relieved that I could just pretend it never happened. For a while, things between us actually got better. Like that night in Vegas had reset something in me, and I could be a good wife again. But over the next few years, I started feeling restless again. Thomas was still doing all the same things, the planning, the schedules, the careful consideration of every decision, and I was starting to feel suffocated by how predictable our life had become. I made some new friends who were more spontaneous, more fun, and they started pointing out how controlling Thomas was, how he never wanted to do anything exciting, how he was holding me back from really living my life. I started guarding my phone more because my new friends would text about plans that I knew Thomas would find some reason to object to. When I'd tell him I was going out, he'd ask a million questions about where and with whom and when I'd be back. And my friends said that wasn't normal, that a husband should trust his wife to make her own decisions. They were right, I was 28 years old, and I shouldn't have to get permission to have a social life. The Friday night that changed everything. I told Thomas I was going out with Kelly and some other friends, and he did his usual thing of asking if I had my phone charger and if I wanted him to pick me up later. I just kissed him goodbye and told him not to wait up. We started at this wine bar downtown, and Kelly was being all weird and judgmental about my new friends, saying they were a bad influence and that I was acting different lately. I told her she was being dramatic and that maybe she was just jealous that I wasn't sitting home every weekend like some boring married person. That's when I met Marcus. He was at the bar with some friends, and when our group started talking, he immediately zeroed in on me. He was charming and funny and kept buying me drinks, and for the first time in months, I felt like someone was actually seeing me as an interesting person instead of just Thomas's wife who'd had some bad luck with pregnancies. Marcus kept asking me questions about my work, my interests, what I like to do for fun, and he actually listened to my answers instead of just nodding along. Kelly kept giving me these looks and trying to get me to leave with her, but I was having actual fun for once, and I wasn't ready for the night to end. When Marcus suggested we go back to his place to keep talking, I knew I should say no, but I also knew that Thomas was probably already asleep. And honestly, what was the harm in talking to someone? I deserved to feel good about myself. I deserved to feel wanted and interesting and alive instead of like some broken thing that everyone had to handle carefully. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, it was morning and I was sneaking out of Marcus's apartment, trying to figure out how to get home without Thomas noticing how late it was. But when I walked through our front door at 6 a.m, there he was, sitting on the couch fully dressed, looking like he'd been up all night. "Where the hell were you?" he asked, and his voice was this cold, flat tone I'd never heard before. "Thomas, I didn't expect you to be up," I said, trying to sound casual, but my heart was pounding because I could tell from his face that this wasn't going to be one of those situations where I could just apologize and move on. "I called Kelly at 2 a.m. when you weren't answering your phone," he said. "She told me you'd left with some guy hours earlier. So I'm going to ask you again, where were you?" I felt this weird hollow feeling in my stomach because I realized Kelly had thrown me under the bus. But I also knew I couldn't lie anymore. "I messed up," I said, sitting down across from him. "I don't know how it happened. I was drunk. I didn't plan it. I just fell into it." Thomas stared at me for a long moment, and then he said, "You expect me to believe you just slipped and fell on some guy's dick?" The way he said it was so harsh and sarcastic. Nothing like the gentle, understanding Thomas I was used to. I started crying because I could see how much I'd hurt him. But I also felt angry that he was being so cruel about it. If you had been more affectionate, if we hadn't lost the babies, maybe I wouldn't feel so broken, I said. Maybe I wouldn't need to find validation from other people. I've been telling you for months that I felt disconnected from you, that I needed more attention. But you just kept planning these stupid date nights instead of actually listening to what I was saying. Thomas got this look on his face like I'd slapped him. "So this is my fault?" he asked. "Because I didn't give you enough attention? You decided to sleep with some random guy. It's not that simple," I said. "I've been in pain for years. Thomas, I've been grieving and feeling like a failure. And instead of helping me through it, you just kept trying to fix everything with your little plans and schedules. You made me feel like I was some project you were managing instead of your wife who was falling apart." He stood up and walked to the window. And when he turned back to me, his face was completely blank. "I cut my work hours," he said. "I planned trips and dates and surprises. I went to therapy with you. I held you every night when you cried. But apparently none of that matters because I didn't give you permission to cheat." "I didn't ask for permission," I said. "I made a mistake. People make mistakes. Thomas, people work through this stuff and come out stronger. Do they?" he asked. "Do they really? Because right now I'm looking at my wife who stayed out all night sleeping with another man. And instead of taking responsibility, she's telling me it's my fault for not being a good enough husband." The next day, Thomas called Kelly, and whatever she told him made everything so much worse. When he came home from work, he looked at me like I was a stranger, like he'd never seen me before in his life. "Kelly says it wasn't an accident," he said. "She says you were flirting with him all night, that you made a choice to leave with him even when she tried to stop you. She says this isn't the first time you've done something like this. I wanted to kill Kelly for making me sound like some serial cheater when the Vegas thing had been completely different. Just a one-time thing when I was grieving and not thinking clearly. Kelly doesn't know what she's talking about. I said, she's been jealous of our marriage for years. She's trying to break us up. But I could tell Thomas didn't believe me anymore. He'd made up his mind that I was this terrible person who'd been lying and manipulating him, and nothing I said was going to change that. On Monday, he called a lawyer. A lawyer? Like I was some kind of criminal instead of his wife who'd made one mistake and was willing to work on our problems. Everyone was being so overdramatic about the whole situation. Thomas filed for divorce within a week. Like our 6 years together meant absolutely nothing. Like one night of bad judgment was worth throwing away our entire relationship. I kept trying to explain that I was drunk, that it didn't mean anything, that I loved him and wanted to fix things. But he just kept saying he couldn't trust me anymore, that I'd demolished our marriage. The divorce was finalized with this clean, fair split of our assets, and Thomas acted like he was being generous by not trying to take more than half of everything. He blocked me on social media, changed his phone number, and basically acted like I'd never existed. When I tried to talk to our mutual friends, they all gave me these polite but distant responses, like they'd already decided I was the bad guy and Thomas was this innocent victim. A few months after everything was final, one of our college friends mentioned something about that Vegas trip from years earlier, about how I'd hooked up with that bartender. Thomas found out, and any tiny chance we might have had of reconciling someday just disappeared completely. He looked at me like I was this pathological liar who'd been deceiving him for our entire marriage, instead of someone who'd made 2 mistakes during the worst period of her life. I tried reaching out to him for months after that. I'd send him letters explaining my side of things, trying to make him understand what I'd been going through, how the grief and depression had made me do things I never would have done otherwise. I sent him gifts for his birthday and our anniversary, just little things to remind him of the good times we'd had together. When that didn't work, I showed up at his office a few times, hoping we could have a real conversation without lawyers and other people interfering. But Thomas had turned into this completely different person, this cold, detached stranger who acted like I was harassing him instead of trying to save our marriage. He had me blocked on everything, and when I'd try to approach him in public, he'd just walk away without even acknowledging me. It was like he'd decided I was this evil person who'd never loved him. Instead of remembering that we'd had years of happiness together before everything went wrong, 2 years after our divorce was finalized, I was at the gym where Thomas worked out, hoping to run into him and maybe have a normal conversation for once. When I saw him, he looked good, really good. Actually, he'd been working out more, seemed more confident. And for a second, I remembered why I'd fallen for him in the first place. "Thomas?" I said, walking over to where he was doing bench presses. "Can we talk for a minute?" He sat up and looked at me with this tired expression, like I was some annoying stranger who kept bothering him. "What do you want?" "Jenna, I wanted to know if you'd be open to sleeping together just one time," I said, because I'd been thinking about it for months and I missed the physical connection we'd had. Not getting back together or anything complicated. Just, you were the only person who ever made me feel safe during sex. And I haven't felt that way with anyone since. Thomas stared at me for a long moment. And then he actually laughed. But not in a good way. "Are you serious right now?" he asked. "You think I want to sleep with you after everything that happened?" "I thought maybe you missed it too," I said. "I thought maybe you'd want closure or something." "Closure," he said, standing up and grabbing his water bottle. "Jenna, you didn't just mess up. You demolished a marriage, lied about it for years, and then spent months stalking me after I made it clear I wanted nothing to do with you. I'm not that guy anymore. The one who'll do anything to make you happy. I'm done. I still love you," I said, because it was true. Because despite everything that had happened, Thomas was still the best relationship I'd ever had. "No," he said. "You loved what I gave you, not me. There's a difference." A month later, I found out through Kelly that Thomas had inherited over $100,000 from his grandmother. $127,000 that he got to keep all to himself because we weren't married anymore. He paid off his mortgage, put money into savings for his business, and took time off work to travel and figure out what he wanted to do next. Meanwhile, I was working a dead-end job and living in a 1-bedroom apartment, struggling to pay my bills and wondering how my life had gotten so far off track. The worst part was hearing from Kelly how well Thomas was doing, how he'd started therapy and was working on himself, how he seemed happier and more confident than she'd ever seen him. She said he wasn't dating anyone yet, but that he seemed open to the possibility for the first time since our divorce. It was like he'd taken everything that was supposed to be ours, the money, the happiness, the future, and built this perfect new life without me. Thomas ended up changing gyms to avoid running into me. And when I tried to reach out through Kelly, She told me he'd asked her not to share information about his life with me anymore. All our mutual friends had basically chosen sides, and I was the one who ended up alone. Even my family thought I should just move on and stop trying to contact him. Like they didn't understand that you don't just get over losing the love of your life because of a few mistakes you made during the worst period of your life. People just don't understand what I was going through during those years. They don't understand what it's like to lose 2 babies and feel like your body is broken. To feel disconnected from your husband even when he's trying to help. To need validation and excitement and proof that you're still a desirable person worth loving. Everyone acts like I'm this terrible person who destroyed a good marriage for no reason. But they don't see the whole picture. They don't see how Thomas's need to control and plan everything made me feel suffocated. How his careful, gentle treatment of me after the miscarriages made me feel like damaged goods. How his inability to understand what I really needed pushed me toward people who could give me what was missing. I made mistakes, yes, but I was dealing with grief and depression and a husband who thought he could fix everything with date nights and therapy sessions. I was 28 years old and felt like my life was over. Like I'd never be happy or excited about anything ever again. When Marcus made me laugh, when Preston made me feel attractive and spontaneous, I grabbed onto those feelings because I was drowning and they felt like lifelines. Now Thomas gets to be the victim in everyone's story. The good guy who was betrayed by his selfish wife, while I'm the one who lost everything: my marriage, my friends, my financial security, my chance at the family I'd always wanted. He gets to inherit money and travel and start over with a clean slate, while I'm stuck dealing with the consequences of decisions I made when I wasn't thinking clearly. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Thomas had been more understanding. If he'd been willing to work through our problems instead of just giving up and calling a lawyer. Sometimes I think about how different things might have been if he'd fought for our marriage instead of throwing it away the moment things got difficult. But mostly I just miss him. Miss the way he used to make me feel safe and loved. Miss the life we were supposed to have together before everything fell apart.